So in this third section of this lecture on transitions, we're going to be taking a closer look at these underlying resistance, interference, and backlash mechanisms that we tend to think go along with processual explanations of why some episodes actually fail, or alternatively, if these things are absent, why they succeed. So if we want to talk about employee behavior, in essence, what we want to think about is, again, this is the way we're going to move up and down from these macro level features that might affect opportunity or threat attributions, or sort of a sense of personal power attribution. There's going to be some sort of new policy adopted that might actually contain some of these features. And then at the low level, individuals are going to have a low personal power attribution, high threat. They're going to basically avoid activity unless they're monitored. So unless you're getting activity along the interface that, say, is decreasing threat and increasing opportunity, say people who are actively working to, oh, this is going to be a great new budgeting policy, let me help you with it. We're going to all come and sort of make sure it gets done. Or if you have increased monitoring activity where people are actually checking, have you turned in your new budget? Like, we all have to make sure you turn in the budget, and they're getting the same sets of messages. What's going to tend to happen is resistance. That people are going to freeze because it's a deer caught in headlights. So these mandated changes won't be implemented. So in essence, what you're going to explain this is resistance by the operating core and or middle managers. However, resistance is sort of not the full explanation, right? It's really this set of things where you have features that affect opportunity and threat, and the absence of activity that is either increasing the monitoring or decreasing threat or increasing power. So, for example, if we want to look at the Michigan housing case, we might think about no authority over spending, the two bosses problem. And even if people did submit house-level budgets, there are higher-level managers were changing them. These were all features that basically increased threat and decreased opportunity. Then in addition, after the new budgeting routine, you had active interference. So again, once again, it's basically increasing threat, not decreasing threat. And so not surprisingly, we saw resistance by the house managers, i.e. they avoided the activity unless they were heavily monitored. And we have the one case where that's not the case, but that probably has something to do with Pearl and her own sense of basically power attribution, that we see that it only took one time and she never repeated it again. So we saw that interference can affect low-level employees, and so what we have to think about is, in essence, what interference is a change mechanism, because basically higher-level managers do things that then affect the behavior of lower-level employees. So any type of feature that can increase political instability in the authorizing environment, like institutional rules, in the case of our budgeting process, right, the fact that it's not at all clear who's in charge, or we might think about the idea that basically there's a class and power conflict. So the residential life staff are from a higher class background and expect to have power. On the other hand, they don't have the same type of priority basically among student concerns or outside vendors. Their programs aren't nearly as important. So you've got that type of a conflict that creates instability. So what you then would end up with something like a new policy, like the suggested new budgeting routine, adopted with incomplete support, and certain people have enough power within the authorizing environment to actually implicitly and explicitly communicate conflicting expectations. This is a form of interference. And so you basically get inactivity or resistance by employees. So what are the types of, what do we think about with this interference? In essence, these are can be exogenous events, but a lot of the idea is that basically these authorizing environment actors are basically failing to monitor or communicate conflicting expectations. This is just another version of the same change mechanism. So at the low level of employee behavior, what we might want to think about interference basically resulting in is not simply resistance, but some variant of role ambiguity and frustration. Because what's in essence happening is inconsistent communication of expectations. So in the case of Michigan, building managers are being told we want you to be community-centered, but then they're not actually being given control because people keep changing their budgets. Or They're being told, well, we want you to all really be a member of the community, but then they get changed to a different building so they can't build up any sense of community stability. So these are the types of things that will typically lead to either, if there's activity, you get a negative feedback loop. So like Pearl being criticized for doing what she had actually been told to do. Or if they originally saw a threat, it's basically just everyone is going to avoid activity altogether. So this is just a chart that helps us understand things. What are the types of features that we might think of as being associated with instability in the Michigan case? So the unbalanced budget committee, the dotted line problems, the different target audiences, the missing adjudicator or the housing director, right? So these are all things, anytime you're missing adjudicators, that's going to tend to stay instability. You need someone to solve disputes. You need a more complete hierarchy. Dotted lines, anything basically that underlines that unity of command, nice pyramid, is going to tend to be something that in essence leads to political instability. And that is exactly what we see in the Michigan case. So again, how does that look? The same Michigan case at the employee level. You get this negative feedback loop from Pearl and Village, as we mentioned before, and also things like these changing managers, the overrolling budgets, not sending budgets, failure to monitor. All of these are about inconsistent communication of expectations. So one could imagine if you were then going to write it up, it becomes easier to think about how the different things that we see in the case, in essence, can be presented as an argument that is consistent as long as we understand behavioral decision making and how that affects what people do. There's also the threat, even though we see a lot of interference in the Michigan case, one could imagine cases, and in fact, I think we might encounter some cases where there's actual backlash. In fact, if you look carefully, I would say we see some backlash, which is more active, actual attacks on the people who are attempting change in the target population. So basically, if you have this people who are in some way within the authorizing environment or have some sort of power over what the outcome is. So in the case of NIOSH, we might think about the DLO managers, for example. Basically, there's a new or proposed change that doesn't have complete support from these stakeholders or target populations. They feel threatened, they have high power, and they can actually try to stop or reverse the implementation activity. So in some cases, right, we see things like, well, they should just fire her in the case of NIOSH this week. So that would look more like a case of backlash.